What happens when a gang of criminals targets a successful black man running a food truck, thinking he's an easy victim, not realizing he's an ex-Special Forces veteran? They're about to learn the hard way that underestimating Jamal was their biggest mistake. Jamal stood in front of his food truck, the smell of sizzling spices and perfectly cooked meats wafting through the air. The vibrant red and gold truck, emblazoned with the bold logo of Jamal's Delights, was his pride and joy. This truck was more than just a business. It was the embodiment of his dream, the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifices, and perseverance. He wiped his hands on his apron and looked around at the bustling street corner where he had parked for the day. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the crowd that had gathered. Jamal smiled as he greeted regular customers with a friendly nod, each one a testament to his growing success. From the construction workers who stopped by on their lunch breaks to the local families out for an evening meal, Jamal's food had become a staple in the community. His signature jerk chicken, flavorful tacos, and savory soul food had a reputation for being some of the best in the city. But getting to this point wasn't easy. Jamal remembered the early days, when his food truck was just a dream. He had started small, with nothing but a worn-down van and his grandmother's old recipe book. No bank would lend him money, and investors didn't believe in his vision. As a black man trying to break into an industry dominated by others, Jamal had faced every obstacle. But he wasn't deterred. He had worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and slowly transformed his truck into a mobile kitchen. There were countless nights where he fell asleep with a head full of worries, wondering how he would pay the bills or where the next batch of ingredients would come from. Jamal's food wasn't just delicious, it told a story. Every dish he served had a piece of his history in it, from his grandmother's secret sauce to his father's hand-me-down cooking techniques. The truck wasn't just a business, it was a connection to his roots, to his family, to a culture he held dear. As the line of customers continued to grow, Jamal worked efficiently behind the counter, orchestrating every aspect of the kitchen with precision. He chopped vegetables, seasoned meats, and grilled with the expertise of a seasoned chef. His focus was sharp, but his presence was warm. Every person who came to his truck left with not only a delicious meal, but also a sense of being seen and valued. Jamal made it a point to remember everyone's name, whether it was a regular or a first-timer. His customers weren't just paying for food, they were paying for an experience, one that left them feeling like they were part of his community. He shared a laugh with Mrs. Harris, the elderly woman who had been coming to his truck every Friday for months. "Jamal, you've outdone yourself this time. This jerk chicken's got me thinking about your grandmother's kitchen in Jamaica," she said with a wink. "I'm just trying to keep her legacy alive, Mrs. Harris," Jamal replied, handing her a freshly wrapped order with a smile. Jamal wasn't just a businessman, he was a mentor. He took pride in guiding the young people who worked for him, many of whom came from troubled backgrounds or lacked direction. They weren't just employees, they were part of his extended family. Jamal made sure they knew that, whether he was teaching them how to slice a tomato or advising them on how to manage their finances, he was there to help them grow. He saw potential in every person who walked through his doors. He knew what it was like to start from nothing, and he wanted to give others the opportunity to succeed. Behind the scenes, Jamal was always juggling multiple responsibilities: ordering supplies, managing finances, keeping the truck in top condition, and ensuring every aspect of the business ran smoothly. It was a lot of work, but he thrived in the hustle. There were times when the long hours wore him down, but the satisfaction of serving great food and watching his business thrive kept him going. As the night wore on, Jamal locked up his truck and leaned against it, looking out at the empty street. The sun had set, but the glow of the streetlights made the world feel alive with possibilities. It had been a successful day, another step closer to his goals. Jamal knew that building a business was a marathon, not a sprint. But as he looked at the empty parking lot, a sense of pride washed over him. He had built something special, a place where people came together to enjoy good food and good company. Jamal wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. Jamal's journey to success didn't begin with the gleaming food truck he now operated with pride. It started in a small kitchen in his mother's house, with a dream and a love for food that had been passed down through generations. Growing up in a tight-knit neighborhood, Jamal learned the art of cooking from his grandmother, who had always believed that food was more than just sustenance. It was a way to bring people together, a language that transcended barriers. Jamal took her lessons to heart, experimenting with flavors and creating dishes that spoke to his heritage. However, his journey wasn't without its challenges. After high school, Jamal knew he didn't want a typical desk job. He wanted to turn his passion into a business. But the road to entrepreneurship, especially for a young Black man, was not easy. When Jamal first began exploring the food industry, he was met with skepticism, doubt, and outright racism. Despite having years of culinary experience, he struggled to secure funding to buy the food truck that would launch his business. The banks were quick to turn him down, offering excuses like lack of experience or an unproven business model. Each rejection stung, but Jamal refused to let it define him. He was determined to succeed. He didn't have the luxury of rich relatives to bankroll his dream, so Jamal worked tirelessly at a series of low-paying jobs, night shifts at fast food restaurants, construction work, even cleaning floors at a local diner, to save up for his truck. There were nights when he had to make do with less, scraping by with just enough to cover rent and basic expenses. He lived in a modest apartment and cut back on luxuries to focus every penny on his goal. The sacrifices were immense, but Jamal held on to the belief that one day he would make it. His big break came when he was finally able to purchase an old, rundown food truck. It was nothing fancy, worn-out paint, a rusting frame, and a broken-down engine, but to Jamal, it was everything. He spent countless hours fixing it up, welding parts back together, and repainting it with his vibrant logo. With every repair, he could feel his dream getting closer to reality. But his challenges didn't end with the purchase of the truck. Jamal soon realized that navigating the bureaucratic red tape in the city would be just as tough. He encountered the same resistance in securing the proper permits. Government officials questioned his ability to operate a food truck, citing zoning issues and health regulations that seemed to target his business more than others. He even faced biased treatment from a few local vendors who dismissed his attempts to find a spot at popular food markets. Some of them outright mocked him, claiming he would never make it as a Black man in an industry dominated by others. Jamal felt the weight of these struggles, but he was unbowed. He sought legal advice and tirelessly filled out paperwork, pushing through the system's biases. He attended community meetings, networking with other local vendors who supported him, and soon earned the right to park his truck in a busy downtown district. With his permit finally in hand, Jamal opened for business. His first day was a test of his resilience. He was nervous. He had no guarantee of success, but he had one thing he could count on: his food. Word spread quickly. People who had heard rumors about the new food truck in town lined up to try Jamal's cooking. The first customer, a businessman named Paul, walked up with a skeptical look, but after one bite of the jerk chicken, his expression changed. He took a moment to appreciate the flavors, then turned to Jamal with a wide smile. "This is the best I've had in years. I'll be back for sure." And he was. As the days passed, the crowds grew larger. Jamal's reputation spread from word of mouth, customers raving about his food to their friends and family, posting on social media, and even bringing in more business. People appreciated the authenticity and heart that went into every dish. Jamal had built not just a food truck, but a sense of community around it. Still, the financial struggles were far from over. The truck required constant maintenance, and Jamal had to make sure he could always keep up with his suppliers. There were times when he had to dip into his personal savings just to keep the operation afloat. But he stayed focused, constantly innovating and improving his menu. He began offering catering services, and soon corporate offices, birthday parties, and even weddings started booking his food truck for special events. With his growing success, Jamal hired a small team of employees, people from his community who he could trust and train in the art of cooking. He built a loyal team, teaching them not just how to cook, but also how to manage the business and treat customers with the same respect and care he had always shown. As Jamal's team grew, so did his ambitions. He started to look for a permanent location in the city, an idea that would allow him to expand his reach and offer a full-service restaurant experience in addition to his mobile food truck. With the momentum he had built and the growing demand for his food, Jamal felt the time was right to take his business to the next level. As he scouted potential spots for his new location, he couldn't help but think back to those early days, the struggles, the racism, the doubts, and how far he had come. But in the back of his mind, he knew that bigger challenges were ahead. While Jamal's business continued to thrive, a darker presence loomed in the shadows of his success. The Crimson Crew, a notorious gang that had been a fixture in the city for years, thrived on intimidation, fear, and a deep sense of territorial control. They were known for their violent methods of maintaining dominance, extorting local businesses, and bullying anyone who threatened their sense of entitlement to the area. With a reputation steeped in intimidation, the Crimson Crew had always maintained a stranglehold over the streets, their influence stretching across the city like a web of oppression. The leader of the Crimson Crew, Vince Malone, was a man who held deep-rooted resentment towards anyone who challenged his domain. He had grown up in a world where his authority was never questioned, where success was something only a few people like him could claim. When Jamal's food truck, Jamal's Delights, started gaining momentum, it wasn't just another business in his eyes. It was an insult to everything he had fought for. Jamal's rise wasn't just a matter of good food. It was a challenge to the power and control that Vincent and his gang had long held over the area. Vincent was a tall, imposing figure with a reputation that struck fear into anyone who crossed his path. His clothes were always meticulously chosen: dark leather jackets, sunglasses that never left his face, and boots that thudded on the pavement with each step. He had the look of someone who was used to being feared, and he liked it that way. Beneath his tough exterior, however, was a burning jealousy. Vincent resented how easily Jamal had built a business from nothing. The success Jamal had achieved without having to answer to people like Vincent enraged him. Jamal, a black man, doing so well in an industry that Vincent considered his territory, made his blood boil. To Vincent, Jamal's success wasn't just a business venture. It was a blatant disrespect to his authority and an affront to everything he believed in. To him, it felt like Jamal was encroaching on what he thought was rightfully his. A black man shouldn't be able to run a business that competes with the likes of the Crimson Crew, and especially not without paying the toll of respect that Vincent and his gang demanded. As the months went by, Vincent grew more obsessed with Jamal. He couldn't stand the sight of the food truck parked on busy street corners, lines of customers eagerly waiting for their chance to taste the famous jerk chicken. Every day, it was a reminder of what Vincent perceived as a challenge to his dominance. His crew members whispered amongst themselves, wondering when Vincent would finally take action. Some of them had voiced their concerns that Jamal's popularity could create a shift in the local power dynamics, and that was something no one in the Crimson Crew was willing to let happen. But Vincent was patient. He didn't want to rush. Instead, he watched Jamal carefully, monitoring his movements and operations. He knew that making a rash move could backfire. He had to be strategic. So, he began to plan a more coordinated attack, something that would make a statement, one that would show Jamal that no matter how successful he became, he would never be allowed to thrive in their domain. The Crimson Crew was known for causing problems for local businesses: extortion, sabotage, and intimidation. They often used violence to maintain their hold on the streets, and Vincent was planning to make an example out of Jamal. He saw an opportunity in Jamal's rise. If he could break him down, ruin his reputation, and force him to close shop, then he would prove a point. Vincent wanted to show that a black man didn't belong in the space he had claimed for himself and his crew. Around the same time, Vincent began rallying his crew to prepare for their attack. They weren't going to just destroy Jamal's business. They were going to destroy everything Jamal stood for. The gang's members were eager for action, feeding off Vincent's growing obsession with taking down the food truck owner. They started watching Jamal's every move, making sure they knew exactly when he would be at his busiest and where he would park next. This wasn't just going to be a petty crime, it was going to be a carefully orchestrated takedown. As Vincent's plan began to take shape, the tension between him and Jamal grew, though neither of them was fully aware of what was brewing. Jamal remained focused on his business, unaware of the looming threat that would soon change everything. But what Vincent didn't understand was that Jamal wasn't someone who would back down easily, not in the face of adversity, and certainly not in the face of racial prejudice and intimidation. Jamal had overcome countless challenges to get to where he was, and he wasn't about to let the Crimson Crew destroy what he had worked so hard for. Vincent's fixation on Jamal and his success would soon set the stage for a dangerous confrontation, one that would test both men's strength, determination, and the limits of their resolve. As Vincent schemed and Jamal continued to build his empire, the rivalry between them was about to reach a boiling point. The once peaceful hustle of Jamal's delights was beginning to feel like a ticking time bomb. At first, the acts of harassment from the Crimson Crew were small, just enough to make Jamal's business harder, but not enough to force him to give up. They started with graffiti. One morning, Jamal arrived at his usual spot to find his truck covered in bold, ugly red spray paint. "Go back to where you came from," sprawled across the side, a hateful message that made Jamal's stomach turn. It was the first real sign that the Crimson Crew had noticed his rise and that their simmering resentment had begun to boil over. Jamal stood in front of his truck, staring at the words. The usual adrenaline rush of frustration and anger began to creep in, but he took a deep breath. This was nothing new. People had been trying to break him down his whole life. He reached for his cleaning supplies, began scrubbing at the paint, and wiped away the hate with simple, quiet resolve. He wasn't going to let this slow him down. It was a reminder that not everyone would cheer for his success. Some people only knew how to tear others down. The graffiti was just the beginning. A few days later, Jamal came to the truck and found that his generator had been tampered with. It wouldn't start, and it took a mechanic several hours to fix it. Jamal had a gut feeling it was the same group, but there was no proof. On top of that, he found a series of anonymous, threatening letters that arrived in his mailbox. They were crude, filled with hate, and warned him to stay out of their territory. They spoke of things like respect and knowing your place, and every letter carried the same chilling signature. Crimson Crew. They weren't just trying to scare him, they were sending a message. But Jamal didn't back down. He knew what he was up against, but he wasn't going to let it take control of his life. Every day, he came back to the truck, wiped down the surfaces, and kept cooking. He knew the importance of staying steady in the face of adversity. However, the community was starting to notice. Regulars began to comment on the graffiti, the damage, and the odd presence of strangers loitering around his truck. Some customers even whispered about seeing the gang members lurking nearby, eyes filled with suspicion. It wasn't just the physical harassment. Jamal could feel the atmosphere in the air change. People were talking, but they weren't sure what to do. Some feared retaliation from the gang if they got involved. Jamal wasn't worried about that. He knew that fear was the Crimson Crew's weapon, and he refused to be afraid. But Jamal also knew that he couldn't fight hate with hate. His life had taught him that people could only change when they were shown compassion. So, one afternoon, when the truck was unusually quiet, Jamal saw a few of the Crimson Crew members standing off to the side, watching him. He didn't hesitate. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked over to them with a calm demeanor. "Hey," Jamal called out, his voice friendly but firm. "I've got some fresh jerk chicken cooking. I'll give you all a plate if you want it." The gang members exchanged puzzled looks. It was a bold move, one they didn't expect from someone they were harassing. Vincent, the leader of the Crimson Crew, wasn't among them, but a few of his crew members were known to hang around the food truck just to make Jamal's life difficult. They had expected him to get angry, maybe retaliate, but Jamal's offer seemed to disarm them for a moment. "Why would you offer us food?" one of them sneered, a man with a deep scowl and tattoos that ran up his arms like chains. Jamal shrugged, his face calm and unbothered by the hostility. "Because food's what I do. It's what I've always done. It's not about who's right or wrong. It's about sharing something good with people. You're welcome to join me if you're hungry." For a moment, there was only silence. The tension in the air was palpable. Jamal stood there, not rushing them, but not backing down either. Finally, one of the gang members, a younger guy with a shaved head, took a step forward. "I don't get you, man," he said, shaking his head. "You're offering us food like we're just normal people. After everything we've done." Jamal's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "I don't believe in fighting hate with more hate. If I can show you a little kindness, maybe it'll make a difference. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but kindness spreads. That's what I believe in." The group stood in stunned silence. After a few tense moments, they reluctantly accepted the food. They didn't speak much as they ate, but Jamal noticed a slight shift in their demeanor. They weren't laughing or mocking him, and the air of aggression that usually hung around them seemed to dissipate, if only for a moment. As Jamal watched them eat, he understood something deeper. This wasn't just about him and his food truck. This was about breaking cycles, about showing that even in the face of violence and intimidation, there was another way forward. Jamal didn't know if the gang would ever stop harassing him, but he knew that for at least a brief moment, he had proven that the way to disarm hate was through compassion, and that small acts of humanity could make a real difference. When the gang members finished eating, they left without another word, and Jamal returned to his work. The harassment didn't stop immediately, but Jamal's response was a reminder that sometimes the quietest strength could have the most lasting impact. The tension in the air had been building for weeks. Every day, Jamal faced more harassment from the Crimson crew, but he refused to let it affect his business. Despite their graffiti, the threats, and the stolen supplies, he stayed focused on what mattered: his food, his customers, and the community he had worked so hard to build. Jamal's philosophy was simple: stay calm, stay steady, and never give in to fear. But that night, something changed. The gang had made up their mind. Tonight, they were going to end it all. It was just after closing time, and Jamal was cleaning up his food truck, wiping down the counters and storing away the last of his ingredients. The street was quieter than usual, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. There were no customers left, no chatter of people enjoying their meals. Jamal had just locked the truck's doors when he heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from behind. Turning around, he saw them, the Crimson crew, coming out of the shadows. They surrounded the food truck, their figures dark and menacing under the dim streetlights. Jamal's heart rate increased, but his movements remained calm, measured. He had been expecting this. The gang had crossed the line more than once, but now they had come for him, bringing with them something more dangerous: weapons. Vincent wasn't with them, but the rest of the crew, about 6 men, each wearing dark clothing and carrying bats, chains, and even knives, closed in on him. The leader, a man named Dante, stepped forward, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "You've been a problem, Jamal," Dante sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "This food truck? It's been attracting too much attention. You're in our territory now. It's time for you to pack up and leave. You've had your fun." Jamal stood firm, his body relaxed but alert, his hands by his sides. He knew he was outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't afraid. Fear was the weapon they relied on, but Jamal wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. "I'm not going anywhere," Jamal said, his voice calm but unwavering. "You can try to stop me, but you won't break me." Dante let out a low laugh, raising his bat. "You'll regret that, trust me." He gestured to the others, signaling them to move in. The men circled Jamal, preparing to strike. The tension was suffocating, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. Then, with a sudden flash of movement, one of the men lunged at Jamal with a bat raised high. In that instant, Jamal's training kicked in. For years, Jamal had been a part of the Special Forces, where discipline, precision, and level-headedness under pressure were paramount. He had faced situations far more dangerous than this, and though he was no longer a soldier, the instincts honed over years of training were deeply embedded in his muscle memory. He knew how to defend himself, and more importantly, he knew how to neutralize a threat without causing unnecessary harm. As the man swung the bat toward his head, Jamal dropped low, sidestepping the blow and grabbing the man's wrist with a quick, practiced movement. With a swift twist, he disarmed him, sending the bat flying into the air. Before the man could react, Jamal swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The gang member let out a yelp, stunned, as Jamal quickly moved to face the next attacker. The second man charged, swinging a chain at Jamal's torso. But Jamal anticipated the move, dodging the strike and using the man's momentum to his advantage. He grabbed the chain, yanked it out of the man's hands, and used it to pull him off balance, slamming him into the side of the truck. The man groaned, dazed, but Jamal didn't pause. He was focused, fluid, moving with precision. The remaining gang members hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to handle someone who was not only standing his ground but taking them down with ease. They had underestimated him, hadn't realized the man they were dealing with wasn't just a food truck owner, but a trained warrior. A third man lunged at Jamal with a knife, his eyes wide with rage. But Jamal wasn't fazed. He deflected the knife with his forearm, knocking it away with a quick jab and a twist. In one fluid motion, he spun around, using his opponent's own weight to send him crashing to the pavement. Now, only 3 members of the Crimson Crew were still on their feet, and Jamal knew that if they didn't back down soon, it would only get worse. But he remained calm, his breathing steady, his focus sharp. He was in complete control. Dante, seeing how his crew was being dispatched with ease, let out a growl of frustration. "Get him," he shouted. But before any of them could move, Jamal quickly took a step back, positioning himself between the remaining gang members and the truck. His eyes flicked between them, assessing their movements, preparing for whatever came next. "You don't have to do this," Jamal said, his voice steady and commanding. "This isn't who you are. Walk away now." For a moment, there was silence. The gang members, all bruised and bloodied, exchanged uncertain glances. The fear that had once fueled their actions now shifted to something else: respect. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the fight ended. Dante waved his hand, signaling for his crew to retreat. They grumbled, but one by one, they turned and walked away, dragging their defeated comrades behind them. Jamal stood tall, his chest rising and falling with each steady breath. He had defended himself, not with rage, but with skill and control. He hadn't just fought to protect his business. He had fought for something bigger: his right to exist and succeed in a world that would always try to hold him back. As the last of the gang members disappeared into the night, Jamal turned back to his food truck, his mind racing. The Crimson Crew had made their move, but they had underestimated him. He wasn't just a man with a food truck, he was a force to be reckoned with. And as he locked up for the night, he knew this battle was far from over. The night of the attack had left Jamal shaken but resolute. His body was sore, bruised in places he couldn't immediately reach, but his spirit remained unbroken. After the Crimson Crew retreated, Jamal wasted no time. He immediately contacted the police, hoping that the authorities would take his case seriously and bring the gang to justice. But what he didn't expect was how much harder the fight would be once the system got involved. The officers who arrived at the scene seemed distracted, as if they had been dealing with similar incidents for far too long. Their responses were curt, and their eyes seemed more focused on the fact that Jamal was black than the violence he had just endured. They took their time gathering statements, and even though Jamal presented the damage to his truck and explained the attack in full detail, the police officers appeared dismissive. "Are you sure this was just some random attack?" one of the officers asked skeptically, scribbling something in his notebook. Jamal, trying to keep his frustration in check, nodded firmly. "Yes. They were harassing me for weeks. They've been vandalizing my truck, sending me threats, and tonight they came with weapons." The officer gave him a side-eye, clearly unconvinced. "And you just happened to fight them off, huh?" Jamal's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I defended myself. They had weapons. I'm not going to let them take me down without a fight." But it was clear that the officers weren't exactly eager to investigate further. Their responses were vague, and they showed little interest in finding out who was truly behind the attack. It wasn't the first time the Crimson Crew had left their mark on the area, and it wasn't the first time a victim had been treated like an afterthought. Jamal could sense it. The gang's influence over the area was like a shadow, stretching far and wide, making the police hesitant to pursue the case. The next few days were a blur for Jamal. His body ached, but his mind raced. The Crimson Crew was still out there and nothing was being done. Jamal realized that if he wanted justice, He would have to take matters into his own hands. But doing that meant he'd be up against more than just a few gang members. He'd have to go head-to-head with a system that seemed determined to protect them. As Jamal walked through his food truck lot the next morning, he saw the familiar faces of his customers. They waved, but there was a new sense of unease in the air. The word about the attack had spread fast. People were starting to ask questions about Jamal, about the gang, and about the local law enforcement. Some of his regulars were scared, not just for Jamal's safety, but for their own. The gang's grip on the area was stronger than anyone had realized. But for Jamal, there was no backing down. He didn't just have a business to protect. He had his dignity, his future, and a community that believed in him. He decided to press charges. He would not let the Crimson Crew get away with what they had done. He reached out to a lawyer, a woman named Laura Harris, who specialized in cases involving small business owners and civil rights. Laura had a reputation for fighting for the underdog, and she understood what was at stake. "Jamal, I'm not going to sugarcoat it," Laura said as they sat in her office. "This is going to be a tough fight. The gang is well-connected, and they've got a lot of influence in this city. The system is stacked against you. But if you're willing to stand up and fight, we'll make sure they know they can't just walk all over you." Jamal nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. "I'm not backing down." The decision to press charges came with its own set of consequences. Almost immediately, Jamal felt the weight of the gang's retaliation. They started showing up at his food truck again, standing on the periphery, watching him with a sense of quiet menace. Jamal didn't flinch. He kept working, serving his customers, and holding his ground. But the tension in the air was palpable. He knew that this wasn't just a battle with the Crimson Crew, it was a battle for justice. As the days passed, Vincent, the leader of the gang, became more vocal in his attempt to spin the narrative. He went to the media, claiming that Jamal had started the fight by attacking his crew unprovoked. Vincent told reporters that Jamal was trying to take over their turf and that the attack was simply a response to his aggression. The press began to eat up the story, fueling the gang's narrative and further discrediting Jamal's version of events. But Jamal wasn't intimidated. As the case moved forward, he continued to stand firm. He knew the truth, and he had the evidence to back it up. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed the gang arriving and initiating the assault. Witnesses who had seen the confrontation began to come forward. Jamal wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a fighter, standing up against a system that had long allowed people like Vincent and his crew to operate with impunity. The stakes were higher than ever. As the courtroom date approached, Jamal's resolve strengthened. This wasn't just about him. It was about sending a message that no one, regardless of their race or background, was above the law. He would make sure that Vincent and his crew felt the consequences of their actions. The case was far from over, and Jamal knew the battle ahead would be long and grueling. But as he prepared for the courtroom showdown, he knew one thing for sure. He was not going to back down. Not now, not ever. The courtroom was packed with tension. The air was thick with the weight of Jamal's decision to take the fight to the legal system. The Crimson Crew had underestimated him, assuming he would back down, but Jamal was standing firm, determined to hold them accountable. The proceedings had started, and it was clear that this case would be no ordinary trial. Jamal sat at the defendant's table, his gaze steady but focused. His lawyer, Laura Harris, sat beside him, flipping through her notes, her sharp eyes never leaving the paperwork. Laura had become more than just his legal counsel. She had become his ally, his advocate. She believed in Jamal's story and was unwavering in her commitment to securing justice for him. The case was already shaping up to be a long battle, but with Laura's guidance, Jamal felt confident. On the opposite side, the Crimson Crew was represented by a lawyer who seemed just as sleazy as the gang itself. The crew's leader, Vincent, stood in the back of the courtroom, his arms crossed and a scowl etched on his face. The other gang members were seated, looking nervous, but still trying to project an air of intimidation. They weren't used to being on the defensive, but they weren't about to let that stop them from trying to manipulate the situation. "Your Honor," the opposing attorney began, "the defense denies all charges against these individuals. We have no involvement in the events that occurred outside Jamal's delights." We have witnesses who can attest to the fact that Jamal was the aggressor and that his actions sparked the altercation. This entire case is a fabrication. The words sent a ripple through the room, but Jamal didn't flinch. He had expected this. The gang had a way of bending the truth, twisting narratives to suit their own interests. They had done it before, and they thought they could do it again. But Laura wasn't about to let that happen. "We've got plenty of witnesses," Laura countered, her voice steady and commanding. "And they're not just random bystanders. They're Jamal's customers, people who know him, people who trust him. They saw exactly what happened, and they're here to tell the truth." The first few days of the trial were an uphill battle. The gang's influence in the neighborhood had proven to be a major obstacle. Several potential witnesses who had seen the attack happen had either gone silent or were too afraid to testify. The intimidation tactics were clear. They were being bullied by the Crimson Crew. Jamal's loyal employees, however, stood by him, offering to testify to the events they had witnessed. Then, something unexpected happened. Jamal's old comrades from the Special Forces came to his aid. They were a group of men who had served with him during his military days, people who knew Jamal's character better than anyone. They had seen his calm under pressure, his discipline, and his unwavering sense of right and wrong. One by one, they took the stand, speaking about Jamal's integrity and his ability to handle himself under extreme circumstances. "He's not the type to go looking for trouble," said Ethan, one of Jamal's old team members. "I've seen him in combat situations, and I've seen him keep his cool." This wasn't about aggression, it was about self-defense. The testimony from Jamal's comrades painted a picture of a man who had fought in battles that most people couldn't even imagine, yet always maintained a deep sense of humanity and respect for others. It made the gang's allegations seem even more absurd. The contrast between Jamal's background and the gang's criminal history became glaringly obvious. The Crimson Crew attempted to retaliate. They tried to throw doubt on Jamal's story, using their usual tactics of manipulation. They claimed that Jamal had been involved in illegal activities, trying to paint him as just another thug who deserved whatever he got. They brought in witnesses who were either disreputable or outright lying, gang members disguised as innocent bystanders, trying to convince the court that they had nothing to do with the attack. Their efforts, however, began to crumble under cross-examination. Laura's sharp questioning exposed the inconsistencies in their stories. The breaking point came when Vincent himself took the stand. His arrogance was palpable, but his composure faltered when Laura asked him pointed questions about his crew's activities in the neighborhood. She brought up the gang's history of intimidation and extortion, and the truth began to emerge. The jury could see that Vincent and his crew had a long-standing record of terrorizing small businesses, and they were willing to go to any lengths to maintain control over the area. Jamal's supporters filled the courtroom, and their voices began to rise, bringing a sense of unity and power to the proceedings. Each person who came forward added weight to the case, people who had known Jamal from the very beginning of his journey. They spoke of his perseverance, his dedication to building a legitimate business, and his refusal to give in to fear. Jamal wasn't just some small business owner. He was a symbol of resilience, and the community was rallying behind him. As the trial neared its conclusion, the evidence against the Crimson Crew was irrefutable. The jury had heard from eyewitnesses, law enforcement, and Jamal's comrades. They had seen the surveillance footage and heard the testimonies that painted the gang in an unfavorable light. And while the Crimson Crew had tried to intimidate witnesses and manipulate the trial, the truth had come to light. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable as the jury deliberated. Jamal sat with his hands folded in front of him, his heart racing, knowing that his future, and the future of his business, was hanging in the balance. The courtroom was quiet, save for the sound of murmured conversations. Finally, the door opened, and the jury filed in. The judge nodded at them. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman said, holding the paper with the verdict in his hands. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts." A wave of relief washed over Jamal. He had done it. Justice had been served. The courtroom was silent as the jury's verdict hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on everyone present. Jamal sat at the defendant's table, his heart pounding in his chest, though he tried to maintain his composure. Laura, his lawyer, sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the judge, waiting for the moment that would define their fight for justice. The judge, a stern and seasoned figure, adjusted his glasses as he glanced at the paper in his hand. His voice cut through the tension like a sharp knife. After careful deliberation, the jury has found the defendants guilty on all counts of harassment, assault, and conspiracy to intimidate a business owner. Sentencing will be scheduled for later this week. A wave of relief washed over Jamal, and he looked at Laura, whose face finally softened with a small but proud smile. The Crimson Crew's leader, Vincent, had been sitting with his arms crossed, trying to project an air of defiance, but now his face had turned pale, his arrogance shattered by the undeniable truth laid out in the trial. The other gang members were in shock, unable to process the fact that their reign of terror had come to a definitive end. The judge's gavel struck the wood with a final, resonant sound. The court is adjourned. Jamal exhaled, his body relaxing for the first time in what felt like ages. It was over. The battle for justice had been won. Outside the courthouse, the streets buzzed with activity. News reporters surrounded Jamal, eager to get a soundbite for their stories. Their cameras flashed as they asked him questions about the trial, about the Crimson Crew, about how he had managed to stand strong in the face of such adversity. But Jamal wasn't interested in the spotlight. He had been through too much for this to be about him. "What does this victory mean for you, Jamal?" a reporter asked, shoving a microphone in front of him. Jamal paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The words that came out weren't rehearsed. They were from the heart. "This victory isn't just for me," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's for everyone who's been pushed down by people who think they can bully and intimidate others just because they're scared of change. It's for every person who's ever had to fight for what's right, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against them. This is about resilience. It's about standing up no matter what." His words resonated with the crowd, and people around the courthouse began to clap and cheer. Jamal wasn't just a successful entrepreneur anymore. He was a symbol of justice, courage, and strength. His story had touched the hearts of everyone who had followed it. Back at his food truck, Jamal's Delights, business was booming. The day after the verdict, the line outside the truck stretched down the block. Jamal's customers had always been loyal, but now, there was a new sense of respect in the air. They weren't just supporting his business, they were celebrating his victory. Jamal's food had always been a reflection of his hard work, passion, and commitment to quality, but now it represented something even greater: resilience in the face of adversity. As he served food to his customers, Jamal was approached by several local business owners, each of them offering congratulations and support. Some of them had witnessed the intimidation tactics of the Crimson Crew firsthand, but hadn't known how to fight back. Now, they saw Jamal as a beacon of hope, someone who had fought for his business and his community and had come out victorious. "You showed us all what it means to stand up for ourselves," one of the business owners said, shaking Jamal's hand. "You gave us hope that we don't have to live in fear anymore." Jamal nodded, grateful for the recognition, but knowing this wasn't the end. The battle he had fought was a significant one, but it was only part of the larger fight for justice and equality. The Crimson Crew had been defeated, but their influence still lingered in some corners of the city. Jamal knew that the work wasn't over, and he would continue to stand up for what was right. That evening, Jamal stood outside his food truck as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city. His customers, his employees, and the community had all rallied around him, and it was clear that the support was more than just about his food. It was about something much deeper, about the idea that no one, no matter their background, should ever be silenced or oppressed. Jamal's victory wasn't just a legal one. It was a victory for every person who had ever been made to feel small, for every entrepreneur who had struggled to build something meaningful in the face of adversity, for every community that had fought to protect its values and people. As Jamal looked out over the crowd, he felt a deep sense of pride. His food truck had been the vehicle of his dreams, but now it was also a symbol of change. He wasn't just serving delicious meals. He was serving a reminder that courage, integrity, and perseverance could overcome even the darkest forces. "Jamal, you did it," one of his employees said, coming over to him with a smile. Jamal looked around at the busy lot, at the faces of people who had become more than just customers. They had become part of something bigger. "We did it," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. And in that moment, Jamal knew that he had truly won, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of everyone who believed in him, his business, and the power of doing what's right. Justice had been served, and the community was stronger for it.